Calaroga Shark Media.
On August 26, 1506, an extraordinary sight greeted the citizens of Rome as they gathered in the early morning light. Pope Julius the Second, dressed in full battle armor and mounted on a war horse, rode through the city gates at the head of an army. Cardinals in their scarlet robes followed behind him, looking decidedly uncomfortable on horseback. The Holy Father was going to war. This was no ceremonial procession or symbolic gesture. Julius was personally leading a military campaign to recapture the papal cities of Perugia and Bologna from local despots who had dared to defy papal authority. This is White Smoke, Episode 30, The Warrior Pope. For the first time in centuries, a pope would command troops in actual combat, wielding both sword and papal keys in pursuit of territorial conquest. Contemporary observers called him Il Terribile, the Terrible One, for his volcanic temper and ruthless determination. History would remember him as the warrior pope, a man whose passion for battle seemed better suited to a Renaissance condottiere than the spiritual leader of Western Christianity. Yet this same violent, crude and militaristic pope would also commission the greatest artistic masterpieces of the Renaissance, transforming Rome into the cultural capital of Europe while conquering enemies on the battlefield. Today, we explore the remarkable contradiction of Julius II, the pope who wore armor and painted angels, who fought wars and created beauty, who embodied both the corruption and the glory of Renaissance papal power. Giuliano della Rovere had been shaped for violence long before he inherited the papal tiara. Born in 1443 to an impoverished family in northwestern Italy, his fortunes changed dramatically when his uncle Francesco became Pope Sixtus IV in 1471. Within months, the 28-year-old Giuliano found himself elevated to cardinal, accumulating bishoprics across Italy and France, like a military commander collecting conquered territories. But unlike most Renaissance cardinals who pursued power through diplomacy and intrigue, Giuliano displayed an almost pathological attraction to military conflict. His first taste of warfare came in 1474, when Pope Sixtus sent him to the papal territory of Umbria to end the fighting between competing factions. Rather than negotiating a peace settlement, Giuliano embraced the chaos of battle with an enthusiasm that shocked even his war-hardened contemporaries. Giuliano della Rovere possessed a temperament utterly unsuited to ecclesiastical life, observes Dr. Christine Shaw, the leading authority on Julius's military career. His violent temper, crude manner, and peasant-like sense of humor marked him as a man who would have thrived as a professional soldier rather than a prince of the church. War energized him in ways that prayer never could. Throughout his 30-year career as cardinal, Giuliano's reputation for violence preceded him wherever he went. He treated subordinates with brutal contempt, flew into rages that terrified even hardened diplomats, and displayed a coarseness of manner that scandalized the refined courts of Renaissance Italy. His master of ceremonies later wrote that Giuliano hardly ever jested, being generally absorbed in deep and silent thought about his next military or political campaign. The election of his enemy, Rodrigo Borgia, as Pope Alexander VI in 1492 drove Giuliano into exile, but even this setback became an opportunity for military adventure. Fleeing to France, he encouraged King Charles VIII to invade Italy and conquer the papal territory of Naples, effectively making war against the very church he claimed to serve. For Giuliano, loyalty to his personal ambitions outweighed any abstract commitment to papal authority when that authority was exercised by his enemies. When Alexander VI died in 1503, Giuliano's path to the papal throne required one final display of his talent for ruthless manipulation. Despite his violent reputation and obvious unfitness for spiritual leadership, he successfully bribed enough cardinals to secure unanimous election as Pope Julius II on November 1, 1503. His first act as pope was to decree that simony would be forbidden in future papal elections, a prohibition that came rather late given his own methods of securing office. Julius's conception of papal authority differed fundamentally from that of his predecessors. Where earlier popes had sought to exercise spiritual leadership over temporal rulers, Julius believed that effective spiritual authority required direct control over temporal power. He would not merely influence kings and emperors, he would become one himself through military conquest and territorial expansion. The papal states that Julius inherited in 1503 bore little resemblance to an organized kingdom. Venice had seized much of the Romagna region after Alexander's death, while local despots in Perugia and Bologna ruled their cities as independent fiefdoms, despite their nominal subordination to papal authority. Rather than accepting this diminished inheritance, Julius determined to reconquer every inch of territory that rightfully belonged to the Church. The campaign that began in August 1506 represented Julius's first opportunity to demonstrate his preferred method of papal governance. Rather than sending diplomatic envoys to negotiate with the Baglioni family that controlled Perugia, Julius decided to appear before the city walls in full battle armor at the head of an army. The symbolism was unmistakable. This pope would not request obedience, he would compel it through force of arms. The sight of an armoured pope leading troops into battle shocked even contemporaries accustomed to Renaissance papal corruption. Paris de Gracie, Julius's master of ceremonies, recorded his horror at watching the Holy Father conduct military planning sessions in his tent, discuss siege tactics with professional soldiers, and personally inspect defensive positions under enemy fire. This was spiritual leadership, unlike anything the Church had ever witnessed. Yet Julius's theatrical display of papal militarism proved remarkably effective. Perugia surrendered without bloodshed on September 13th, after the Baglioni family calculated that resistance against papal armies was futile. The Pope's willingness to risk his own life in military campaigns demonstrated a commitment to territorial conquest that intimidated potential opponents while inspiring his own forces. The siege of Bologna proved more challenging, requiring 2 months of actual warfare before Giovanni Bentivoglio's forces finally capitulated. Julius personally directed artillery bombardments, reviewed casualty reports, and planned assault strategies with the cold professionalism of a military commander. When Bologna finally surrendered on November 10th, the Pope entered the city in triumph, accepting the submission of its citizens as both their spiritual father and conquering general. Julius's military successes extended far beyond individual campaigns to reshape the entire geopolitical balance of Renaissance Italy. His formation of the League of Cambrai in 1508 created an unprecedented alliance between the papacy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain for the purpose of destroying Venetian power in northern Italy. For the first time in centuries, a pope had organized a continental coalition for purely territorial objectives. The League's devastating victory over Venice at the Battle of Agnadello in May 1509 restored most of the Romagna to papal control, while demonstrating Julius's ability to coordinate complex military alliances. Yet even this triumph failed to satisfy his territorial ambitions, as he immediately began planning new campaigns to drive all foreign powers from Italian soil. Julius's decision to turn against his former French allies in 1510 revealed the purely opportunistic nature of his military policies. Having used French armies to defeat Venice, he now organized a Holy League with Spain and England to expel those same French forces from Italy. His justification for this betrayal was characteristically direct. France had become too powerful to serve papal interests, so France must be destroyed. The Pope's personal leadership of the siege of Mirandola during the winter of 1511 became legendary throughout Europe. At age 67, Julius endured the hardships of winter campaigning alongside common soldiers, slept in military tents, and personally supervised the placement of artillery batteries. When enemy cannon fire struck near his position, the Pope refused to retreat, declaring that God would protect his vicar on earth. Yet Julius's military adventures came at an enormous cost that extended far beyond the financial burden of maintaining professional armies. His willingness to use spiritual weapons for temporal objectives thoroughly compromised the Church's moral authority throughout Europe. When he excommunicated Venice for refusing to surrender papal territories, he reduced excommunication from a spiritual penalty to a diplomatic tool. When he placed France under interdict for supporting his enemies, he transformed church sacraments into weapons of political warfare. The intellectual elite of Europe watched Julius's military campaigns with growing horror and disgust. Erasmus, the greatest humanist scholar of the age, wrote a devastating satire called Julius Excluded from Heaven that depicted the warrior pope arriving at the gates of paradise in full armor, only to be denied entry by St. Peter himself. The spiritual leader of Christianity, Erasmus suggested, had become indistinguishable from any other violent tyrant pursuing territorial conquest. Yet even Julius's harshest critics had to acknowledge the effectiveness of his military methods. By the end of his reign in 1513, the Papal States had been transformed from a collection of rebellious city-states into a unified territorial monarchy capable of competing with the major powers of Europe. The Pope who wore armor had succeeded where centuries of diplomatic popes had failed. More remarkably, Julius somehow found time between his constant military campaigns to commission the greatest artistic achievements of the Renaissance. His decision to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica from the ground up created employment for hundreds of craftsmen while establishing Rome as Europe's architectural showcase. His patronage of Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante produced masterpieces that would define Western art for centuries to come. The apparent contradiction between Julius's military brutality and artistic refinement reflected the complex nature of Renaissance papal power. The same man who personally directed artillery bombardments also spent hours in intimate conversation with Michelangelo about the theological symbolism of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The Pope who terrorized enemies on the battlefield also served as intellectual collaborator with Raphael on the philosophical themes of the Vatican apartments. Julius's relationship with Michelangelo exemplified this fascinating duality. Despite their similarly volcanic temperaments and frequent quarrels, the two men developed a creative partnership that produced some of the most sublime religious art in human history. The Pope who fought wars to expand papal territory also created visual representations of divine beauty that would inspire spiritual devotion for centuries. When Julius died on February 21, 1513, he left behind a legacy that perfectly captured the contradictions of Renaissance papal power. His military campaigns had restored papal territorial authority while thoroughly corrupting papal spiritual authority. His artistic patronage had created transcendent beauty while serving his own ego and political ambitions. Contemporary observers struggled to reconcile the various aspects of Julius's complex personality. Some praised him as the savior of papal independence, who had rescued the Church from political irrelevance through decisive military action. Others condemned him as a violent usurper who had perverted spiritual authority for worldly conquest. Yet perhaps the most accurate assessment came from those who recognized that Julius had simply carried Renaissance papal power to its logical extreme. The institutional corruption that had characterized the papacy for centuries had finally produced a pope who openly embraced the role of secular prince while maintaining the pretense of spiritual leadership. Julius the Second remains unique in papal history as the only pope to personally lead military campaigns while simultaneously commissioning transcendent religious art. His reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of unlimited papal power, showing how spiritual authority could be used to achieve remarkable worldly success at the cost of moral credibility. The warrior pope's legacy would haunt the Church for generations, providing ammunition for critics who questioned whether papal claims to spiritual leadership could be reconciled with the obvious pursuit of temporal power. His example would inspire Protestant reformers who argued that the papacy had become thoroughly corrupted by worldly ambition. Yet Julius also established precedents for papal patronage of the arts, that would transform Rome into the cultural capital of Europe for centuries to come. The Pope who wore armour into battle also created the institutional framework that would produce St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, and countless other masterpieces that continue to inspire wonder and devotion. In the end, Julius the Second embodied all the contradictions of Renaissance civilization itself, a culture capable of producing both sublime beauty and shocking violence, transcendent spirituality and crude materialism, genuine religious devotion and cynical political manipulation. He was, quite literally, a man of his times, and those times demanded both warriors and artists, conquerors and creators, temporal princes and spiritual fathers. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.
You can call me James. I spent 23 years designing aircraft that officially don't exist for agencies you think TV made up. Until I started asking the wrong questions. Navy ships are recording objects moving at impossible speeds. Infrastructure is failing in coordinated patterns. The moon looks smaller than it did 10 years ago. None of this is a coincidence. The official explanations don't add up. This is Paranormal Aliens, where we connect the dots they don't want connected. If you're hearing this, you know where to get podcasts. Follow Paranormal Aliens. New episodes weekly until they shut me down.
Want to hear your favorite shows without any ads? It's easy. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, just tap the banner that says Uninterrupted Listening and unlock commercial-free versions of this show and all your other Calaroga favorites for just $4.99 a month. Even better, you get a 30-day free trial to start. That includes Palace Intrigue, your daily dose of royal family drama, 5 good news stories where we spotlight feel-good headlines, 5 daily trivia questions to test your brain, daily comedy news, bringing you the latest in comedy, celebrity trials for the biggest courtroom showdowns, and Taylor Swift Today for all things Taylor. Plus, coming September 14th, binge Season 2 of the hit series Crown and Controversy. This season, we explore how everything changed the moment Meghan met Harry, and the ripple effects that shook the royal family to its core. The power struggles, the family fractures, and the love story that rewrote the royal rulebook. All episodes drop that Sunday exclusively for subscribers. Go ad-free, binge more, and never miss a beat. Tap Uninterrupted Listening now.